My background is actually in linguistics and American Sign Language. So this is actually a really big turning point in my life to actually be able to present about LGBTQ plus topics, something I've always wanted to do, never really been able to, and I'm really excited to actually share this all with all of you. So I did actually, and I will show these books at the end when I finish sharing my screen, but I did get most of my information from about 3 sources and a TikTok because, I knew high schoolers were going to be here, so got to get those TikToks in. Um, I looked up how to properly cite that TikTok as well in my APA manual. So if you teach English or you have an English class and your teacher tells you, oh, you can't cite a TikTok, no, I think you can cite a TikTok. So I would like to thank, Michael Brunsky, Matthew Reimer, Leighton Brown, and his name is escaping me right now, but a British talk show host as well, for all of their information and all of their hard work that I kind of compiled together into a presentation for us today. So I do want to start with this TikTok. I saw this TikTok and I knew it was really a quote that I had to share with all of you today. And that is, why is it so important that we study history? And basically in the end, he said, we come into this world with zero context of how we got to this moment of history or what that means for our lives. And it's very important for all of us as LGBTQ plus people or allies to the LGBTQ plus community to understand that the world that we currently live in comes from somewhere, and there are events in history that really bring us to where we are today. And so when I put together this presentation, the first thing that I wanted to tackle was really, well, sorry, I forgot, I needed to lay some ground term work for some terms. I do use these 2 terms interchangeably, but I also use them very specifically. So throughout the presentation, when I use the term LGBTQ+, I am really talking about either an individual who identifies as one of the labels in that acronym. I could also be talking about the United States, Canada, or Europe, or other countries that follow these terminologies. And when I use the word queer, I do self-identify myself as queer. I don't use any of the LGBTQ+ labels. I'm using it as the umbrella term. I use it for the countries and cultures that do not follow the LGBTQ+ acronym. We do need to understand that all cultures have their own understanding of sexuality and gender. So it's very important for us to note that when we talk about certain countries, for example, when we look into a lot of the Asian cultures, they don't always follow LGBTQ+, and their understanding of gender and sexuality does not always align to our understanding of gender and sexuality. So when I use the term queer, it's because I'm talking about a culture outside the United States or outside of a culture that uses LGBTQ+, or I'm using it for people who we have documentations. We perceive they are part of the LGBTQ+ community, but we have no proof because they never wrote about it. And that's what we're going to see very often. We see a lot of history, especially the further we go back. It really just says, oh, possibly they are X, Y, or Z, but we really don't have any physical proof because they never said, oh yes, I am gay, or I am a lesbian, or I am trans. And that's also because those terms did not exist for most of history. So again, I will be going back and forth between those 2 terms. Really what you need to understand is when I say the words LGBTQ+, that person is either we have written record or some type of record that they are part of the community, or I'm talking kind of more United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, versus queer, which is those cultures who are going to fall outside of the same understanding of gender and sexuality that we have. So today's focus of the presentation is really mostly the United States. I did highlight Europe just because there are going to be a little bit of components for Europe because Europeans conquered most of the world. And that is something that we have to accept and we have to acknowledge as a fact, that their influence is going to really go over the entire globe. But before we get into the United States, I do want to recognize a few of our other cultures from around the world, and I do want to make sure that we understand that queer people are not only located to the United States, are not only located to European cultures, they do exist all over. We have records from China, Emperor A and Dongjian. This is a lot of written records about the two of them. They have a very close relationship. They spent a lot of time together. There is a very cute story where one of them falls asleep on the other, and instead of waking him up, he cuts the sleeve off of his shirt so he doesn't have to wake him. I want to recognize that in India, that they do recognize that their gender, and I'm not going to talk deep into that because I'm not well versed in Indian culture. So I don't know what the current situation is on that. I've read some positive things and some negative things on that. The Kama Sutra, I won't talk most about that because for adults who know what that is, we know what that is. And for teenagers, please wait until you're an adult to go look up what that is. I do want to recognize that in ancient Greece, Thebes was very popular for their idea of creating close bonds with each other and having these strong relationships. And we're not going to explicitly state that, oh, everybody in Thebes was LGBTQ plus, all of them were gay. We have no records of that, but we do need to recognize that most likely that comes from that idea that if I have a strong personal connection with another person, I'm going to fight much harder for that person. And that's where we believe that comes from when we talk about Thebes and we talk about this group of individuals, is that all of that comes from this idea of, well, if we have these two men have a very close relationship with each other, then when one of them is about to get killed, the other one will hopefully kill that person. We even have Neolithic and Bronze Age drawings and sculptures, cave drawings, a lot of different things. We do need to recognize again, we have no idea what these things mean. The further we go back in time, the more confusing it gets, because you're like, okay, we have this drawing of a person. We don't know if that's a positive drawing. We don't know if that's a negative drawing. We don't even really know what the drawing is supposed to mean. But we do know that it is LGBTQ plus or queer related, because sometimes it's showing feminine and masculine features on a singular person. We have a burial of a person who is, their sex is male, but their garments were female, and this was found in the now Czech Republic in Czechia. And again, it raises the question, why were they a male anatomy and feminine clothing? Was this appropriate at the time? Were people who lived in this area open and accepting of queer people, of people outside of the binary gender spectrum that we are all exposed to for most of our life? We have Symposium, which was a huge discussion in Greece. These different philosophers all talked about the different city-states at the time. There were areas of Greece that were accepting of homosexuality. There were other areas that were not. And again, it just brings to light that, wow, usually when we talk about queer history, queer people, we talk about in the now sense, and it tends to be a negative discussion. But really, this discussion has been going on for centuries and for thousands of years. We did not just appear one day out of the blue saying, hey, we want to mess things up. We just want to stir the pot. No, we've always been here, always in the background. And I think, you know, in my research and preparing this, I was having so much fun just, I wish I knew that was happening during the Civil War and that during the American Revolution. And wow, okay. And then going back to China, again, very briefly, a lot of male companions with emperors. Again, raising the question, is this an acceptable part of history? Are people accepting during this part of history because he is the emperor? Or could the regular person out on the street also get in a same-sex relationship and have that same positivity or that same like, oh, whatever, that just can happen, okay. And then lastly, again, some more writings. Albius wrote 3 poems centered on homosexual love as a theme. So again, I really wanted to bring all of these in. I try to find different places from around the world. I know this is not everything. I know there's more. I highly encourage you all to even just go to Wikipedia and just see what's out there. And so you can really get exposure to the different parts of history, the different cultures, because we know queer people exist all over the planet, and they've always been here. And it's really interesting to study these different cultures and really understand how people in the past perceive gender and sexuality, because we look at how people perceive gender and sexuality now and you ask, wait a minute, how did we get here? Has it always been hatred? And it hasn't always been hatred. It's been respect. It's been positions of power for queer people. And hopefully throughout today, you can see how we get to the current political, socio-political climate of the United States today. So it's going to be fun. We are going to talk about colonialism. We will have to mention slavery. We just have to remember that we have to acknowledge these things. They are part of history. I love history because everything is so interconnected. And so when we look back into the colonial Americas and Europeans first arriving, of course, the first thing they're going to be shocked about is, one, there's people here. 2, it's people they've never met. And 3, wait a minute, you don't have strict gender norms? Women and men are wearing each other's clothing? That woman is the leader of the whole group? That man is a religious person? Wait, you think there's more than just male and female? And so that's the first thing that we see in a lot of the writings. A lot of these earlier colonists, and I'm not going to call them explorers, I will call them colonists. A lot of these early colonists are coming to to the Americas, which is now the United States, and seeing all of these other groups, and they really write in a very negative way. And whenever the colonist is religious, of course, the Bible is going to be brought into these things. And we have to take a step back when we study this part of history, because our records of the indigenous people of Americas are not from the indigenous people. So we always need to be very cautious when we read these writings. So if this is a topic that you want to explore more of, and I'm really trying to condense as much as possible, I wish we could just do a whole course on this together. Not at this moment, I don't think that's plausible. But I highly, warn all of you, if this is an area or topic that you really want to get into, like what were the indigenous populations' perspective and views on gender, because they were very loose compared to what we think of when we think of gender. That we should always make sure that we take a step back and remember, wait a minute, this is not from the actual indigenous people, this is from a colonizer's perspective. And we see that again when we're talking about the Aztecs and the Incas. A lot of our records and a lot of our history is from the negative colonist perspective. We really don't know as much as we know. So really what happens when the colonists first arrived to the Americas and as we first established colonies is that we already know that these new people to this land are going to have a negative view of gender and sexuality. And we know the first people to arrive are the Puritans. And this is also the first time that we actually see some records of, in the United States, and now in the United States, that homosexuality, same-sex relationships were happening in the 1640s. And this was, a real big shock to me when I first learned this, because nobody mentioned this when we read what's the Salem witch trials. Nobody said that was happening at the same time. A lot of men were being punished to death or to hard labor or whatever punishment they can think of, because they were like, whoa, you shouldn't be doing that. I think it's very interesting. Nicholas Sensen, he's not sentenced to death. He's tried 3 times. In the 1640s, in the 16, oh, sorry, that should be the 1660s. Both times he's kind of just acquitted. They're kind of just like, well, it happened. Nothing comes from it. I mean, it's not until 1677 that he's actually tried, but he's not sentenced to death. They're kind of just like, yeah, no, we're gonna put you in the, oh, geez, that word slipped. That thing where you put your arms in your head and you're kind of just in the
The
public.
stocks.
Thank you so much. Yes, right. I think they put up his house as well. It became property of the government, but he wasn't sentenced to death. And again, this is going to bring this question back up and up that we'll keep discussing and keep saying, why are some people sentenced to death and some people not? And really, a lot of historians will say, well, could it possibly be political power, or what power do they have in society at this moment? It's not until 1696 that Massachusetts actually passes a law that forbids cross-dressing. And it's always so interesting to read the arguments for why things are done to reduce same-sex sexual encounters. I don't know how preventing cross-dressing prevents same-sex sexual encounters, but apparently they do, whatever makes them happy, I guess, at night. What's really important during this time period is that the Puritans are laying down the groundwork for a negative perspective on LGBTQ plus people. Right before the Puritans arrive, before the colonists arrive, the Americans have a very open-minded conversation with gender. As I said in the last slide, right, females were chiefs, men were wearing female clothing as well. Some tribes are not wearing any clothing. It's very different. But with the Puritans, they're laying a specific groundwork. And if the groundwork is now that same-sex sexual behaviors and identities need to be hidden, then anybody new who comes into the colonies has to follow those rules. And this is where we get that groundwork to where we are today. I do want to talk about slavery very quickly, and that's just because when we accept slavery, the process of slavery is saying that this group of people is now no longer the same group of people that we are. And it begins the process of othering. And when you begin the process of othering, you can then later deny their rights to citizenship and deny their rights to anything you want. So by early American settlers and colonists coming to the United States and saying, these people are now others, I now have the groundwork to say, those people are others, those people are others. And now we have a nice system to say, perfect, us as the white men are going to be the one in charge and everybody else is going to be those other groups, and we get to decide what's happening there. So I do want to just talk about how slavery actually kind of influences the othering process of LGBTQ plus people, and we will see it throughout history. We know they did it with women. We know we did it with Latinx people. We know we did it with Mexicans. We know we did it with Asians, especially with the Chinese, with the Chinese Exclusion Act. This is a process that happens again and again. So into the American Revolution, more interesting stories. And the first time we are getting some records of women dressing up as men and entering the war, of course. And it's very interesting, excuse me, to watch that some of these people who are entering the war are entering the war to fight for the freedom of the American colonies and then go back to being a woman. We have some individuals who fight in the war and just live their entire life as a man afterwards. And we have somebody like Jemima, who has this religious experience where she believes, where they believe that Christ has now entered their body, and for the rest of their life does not identify as male or female, that they dress in gender neutral clothing. They use she, he pronouns the entire rest of their life. So again, like things we don't get taught in, 11th grade history class or whenever we learned about the United States and the American Revolution. I think it's very interesting. There were some, oh, I didn't include that part. Okay, that was another thought I thought I did. But, you know, writing to the Continental Congress and saying, hey, dudes, you're all men in that Continental Congress right now. We just want to remind you that there are women here. You can be completely different than everybody else before. You know, we're doing something new here. So let's go all out. And sending this letter saying, hey, why don't we say men and women are treated equal? And then, of course, the men then saying no, and then having to have them fight for their rights hundreds of years later. Very interesting between Lafayette and Washington, especially when I was reading this, I'm just thinking Hamilton, and I'm just like, come on, Lin-Manuel, where was this part of the musical? Because you read these letters and you're like, oh yeah, they're friends. And then you read one of his later letters and you're like, that doesn't sound like a friendly letter. That sounds like somebody's mad at their significant other. Lafayette, can you please explain? And it's very interesting to kind of read these letters. But again, this is one of those instances where we're like, okay, well, we can't label anybody. We can't label Washington or Lafayette as LGBTQ+, but it raises questions. And it also kind of shows us that, okay, maybe this time period is a little bit more, you know, okay and accepting of strong male bonds, a very strong bromance, as we would say today, right? And we are also getting some writings of what women are seeing during the war. And this is very important because up till now, right, men are very macho, men are very, you know, won't show emotion, men are very quote unquote strong. And with each war that we enter, that breaks down more and more. And as masculinity gets to be broken down and men are able to show something that's a little bit more feminine, that allows the greater population to become more accepting of differences. And that's really where a lot of the roots come from with how people feel towards gender and sexuality. Everybody wants everybody to be in box A or box B. But as you break down box A and box B, then you're allowing people to be in the spectrum. And I see there's a lot of comments, and sorry, I haven't even, you know, and they were roommates. Okay, as we get into Western expansion, again, we're seeing a lot of changes. The gold rush, it's all men out there. There's not a lot of women. So of course, some things are probably gonna be happening on the West Coast. This lays the groundwork of San Francisco as we know it today as one of the queer capitals of the world. There is a reason why it's San Francisco. It's because in 1849, there were only 300 women there, and the other 24,700 people there were men. So it starts allowing freedom for men to explore themselves. I mean, in a population of that size, there has to be statistically some LGBTQ plus individuals. At the same time, we are starting to get a few more writings and more of a discussion about what is gender, what is sexuality. This is really the time period where people are like, okay, wait a minute. Yeah, no, we kept seeing that stuff in history, and you know, Lafayette wrote that letter to Washington at one time. That was kind of weird. Yeah, I think we need to actually talk about this. Something's happening, and this begins the time period where people are like, okay, wait, yeah, you know, let's analyze people, let's interview people, let's try to figure out what is causing this. And sometimes the cause of it is like, oh yeah, you know, I'm generally curious, let's figure this out. And of course, sometimes those causes are going to be negative, right? And we get some books like Moby Dick, South Sea, that yeah, are racist, but they also have a little bit of same-sex relationship, homosexuality in there. And it's kind of like, okay, we're going to kind of have this conversation soon, but we're not there yet. And it's just a little bit and a little bit at a time of introducing more LGBTQ plus people. And so when we say that, oh, LGBTQ plus is the last 40 years, it's kind of like, well, no, these conversations have actually been going on for a long time. And to me, that's kind of shocking when I first realized that, because I mean, I think about my grandparents, and I'm like, well, they never really said anything about that. And I'm sure their great grandparents, my great grandparents, didn't say anything about that. But reading these things, you're like, oh, well, maybe they did have a conversation one time about, you know, what is it to feel same sex attractiveness. We then get into the Civil War, and this is a huge shift because it's going to expose that, yeah, men, you ain't you ain't that. You thought you were, but you're also, you know, kind of weak. You can also show emotion. You're not physically perfect. Um, and again, we're going to have a lot of women going into the war, dressing up and saying, nope, my name's Paul, and entering the war. We have Walt Whitman, who is very interesting because you're like, oh, he wrote poems and letter towards men. And then you read that he was going into the hospitals, and it's just like a guy and he's almost dying, and he's like, oh, I think you're so sweet. And you're, I mean, I don't know if that's the best time, sir, to write a letter. Maybe when he's feeling better. But Walt Whitman starts writing poems and letters. If I remember correctly, he does get fired from his job, of course, because of that. So again, we're at a very interesting dynamic in society because people are having this conversation on what is gender, sexuality. Is it okay? We have, of course, the religious side saying, no, 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 this is not okay, this is not okay. And that's not them saying, oh, it's in the Bible. That's them saying, no, men, remember, are men, and women are women. That's really their earlier arguments. They don't really want the two groups to intermingle. They really want to keep everything the same and keep everything men, women. You're going to get married, you're going to have kids, and it's going to keep happening, keep happening. But at the same time, we have some people like Charlotte and Matilda who are being publicly acknowledged as a couple, living together as a couple. And it's like nobody's batting an eye, and if they are, nobody's actively pursuing something to punish them. So again, we are getting more traction into this. Let's figure out what's going on. What is gender? And of course, we're going to go medical and psychological. As we shift from one century to the next, we do see a rise in progressivism, but of course, with every step forward, there's a group that's going to take a stronger step back. And so really there's a push for no more alcohol, no drugs, no sex, abstinence, all these things that, no, we're going to start pushing this as society starts to try to understand and accept these different parts of nature and humanity. 1892, the first time the word homosexual shows up by Dr. James Kieran, believing that is something related to the mental state. And this is very common at the beginning. People keep thinking, well, that man wants another man because inside he is a woman. And you're like, well, let's hold on to that for a different thing. Because you're going somewhere. That is something. But this is not related to sexuality. But I like that thought process, but not quite there yet. And we also see the rise of labor movements. And labor movements are very important because what labor movements teach us is that, oh, so what you're saying is that we don't all have to be the same ethnicity to be connected? You mean we could just all have a similar idea and a similar goal and work together for that goal? So with the rise of labor unions, we also start to see the rise of LGBTQ plus people coming together and saying, well, if they're going to fight for, if they're going to fight for their rights, let's fight for our rights. Just like in Newsies, yeah, right. 1899, or I think it's at the turn of the century. Yeah, I think I know that movie and musical very well. And then we get into, of course, capitalism and the wonderful world of capitalism and how that affects everything. Is that we're going to, of course, capitalize on gender. What can't we can't capitalize on? And so this is the part of the presentation where we're kind of going to focus on one area and go through it a few different times. But the first thing we have is mass consumerism. People are starting to get money. What can we do? Oh, great, perfect. We can sell toys and dolls to certain groups of individuals. One, reinforcing gender stereotypes, keeping with our new idea of manliness and masculinity, which is Teddy Roosevelt at this time, somebody who's very strong-headed and who also was the president of the United States. And the reason why, again, we're also pushing toys, especially in the military toys for boys, is because we have a lot of war going on. We have the Spanish-American War. We have the occupation of Haiti. We will have both world wars happening at the same time. There's so much happening in the world that allows certain people to really, put their foot down on their belief, saying that this is going to be masculine and this is going to be feminine. And so what we're really seeing is, two roads, and they're going to be parallel all the way to now, because we're still having this struggle on gender and sexuality. We have the wonderful Eleanor Roosevelt, which my grandmother is named after, who convinces FDR to start appointing women to high position of power. The first female secretary of the Treasury, Mary McLeod, to be the director of the Division of Negro Affairs and the National Youth Administrator. Her political mentors are lesbians. She's part of a very strong female group. We know she has her love affair with one of her best, great friends, who after it's all over, it becomes a whole mess. But we're seeing a lot more evidence of LGBTQ plus people. And again, it's kind of difficult with Eleanor Roosevelt to label her because she herself never labels herself. But we have all the letters and we have all of these other sources of information of the affair. So it's an up and down. Right. Okay, we do get into, of course, World War II. And at this time, we have a huge shift. I'm sure all of our students know this part, that women go to work. Because this is the part of history class that is actually taught and kind of enforced and really pushed this understanding that women are going to work. But let's take that a step further. And what does that mean to the lesbian community? Because before this time, right, women were allowed to have a job, really. They weren't allowed to have their own bank account. They weren't allowed to have money. Therefore, they're dependent on a man, and therefore most of them were probably in relationships with a man, living with a man, possibly getting married to a man. But what the war does for the lesbian community is says, hey, you don't actually need that anymore, because we have to force you to work so that we can win the war. And so when we talk about, oh yeah, after the war, women, many of them don't go back to the home. Yeah, but let's also recognize that, part of that many who are not going back to the home is the lesbian community saying, oh, we don't got to depend on anybody anymore. I can do my own thing. And that is a huge step forward, that they are no longer tied down to having to marry a man so they have a place to live. So, I mean, that is a great thought and a great thing to keep in mind, especially in history class when you're like, okay, it's, just more of the same things over and over, a bunch of straight people. And you're like, wait a minute, what does this mean for the LGBTQ plus community? How can this affect us? At the same time, homosexuality is, of course, a personality disorder. That's always fun. You can be discharged and you can be not allowed to join the army. However, at this time, they're also kind of desperate. So there's a great story. A guy says, yeah, I didn't think they were going to let me in because of my, my S's and how I spoke and how I walked and talked. But they just said, do you like girls? And I said, yes, and they let me in. So it was very loose back then on, letting anybody into the military. We need them in the military. In the military, we're not going to raise questions because we need to fight together. We need to work together. So the gay men, we're just going to ignore them. We know they're there, but we're just going to, put a pin on that and come back to that issue later. And they do at the end of the war and say, okay, we're going to start discharging people for Section 8. Which basically classified that individual as a mental illness. So although gay men are allowed to fight in the war, they are not overly burdened with, the war itself and having to deal with their comrades. Most of them and many of them are going to get a Section 8 discharge, which classifies it as a mental illness, which excludes them from all of their VA benefits, and also usually meant they couldn't get a job after the war. So a tiny step forward, and a huge step back for those who did participate. So it's kind of sad because, of course, they did so much to fight in the war, and then they get all of their benefits removed. Right after World War II, let's go back to that San Francisco story, right? We said in the gold rush, we had all those men in that one location. Yeah, we're going to add a lot more men to that one location because at the end of the war, where are people going to go? To all of the ports on the West and East Coast. So if you ever wonder why, it's New York City, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and all of these port places on the edge. It's because the gay men came back and said, yeah, I'm not going home. And they all kind of just collectively stayed. And that was for multiple reasons. Of course, most of it's probably going to be home life. Who wants to go back home after you were able to explore the world, meet new people, most likely meet other LGBTQ plus people during the war? A lot of them just decided to stay and create communities. And community planning, this changes a lot because although there is a high increase in families post-war and we have the boomer generation, at the same time, we have a high increase of people living alone and living as couples. One for the heterosexual community, but also because of the LGBTQ plus community. They're gonna live with each other or they're going to live alone. We now have a huge congregation of people who like the same things in one location. So bars and clubs also go on the rise during this time. But of course, because we are in the United States and segregation is still a thing, we also need to recognize that these communities, although the LGBTQ plus community is a marginalized group, they're very oppressed. Within any group, there's always going to be other intersections of racism or sexism within those groups. So of course, we're going to still see that. So when we talk about these communities, we're also looking at communities that are being created for white LGBTQ plus people, because most of the time, Black and other people of color, their communities are not going to be created yet, especially post-World War II. They're still in their original communities where they were originally born and raised, right? And we have to look at what else is happening, which is segregation at the time. Of course, if we have Jim Crow laws, we have so many other things that now play a part into how both of these communities are intermingling. In 1950, we also have William Parker, who becomes the chief of police in LA, and we see a huge increase in sex perversion crimes. And this is because William Parker was a very big, yeah, we're gonna stop the crime before it happens. So we see a huge increase in that. This one was very interesting when I first learned about the Lavender Scare because it's so similar to McCarthyism, and it's so similar to the Red Scare. And if you remember, at this time in 1950s, it's really bad to be a communist. And we want to make sure that we point out the communist and tell people that person is not a good person, they're a communist. At the same time, we're also having the lavender scare, which is a worry that LGBTQ plus people will be telling secrets to other nations. And and this is, I mean, I don't know if there's history teachers, and this is a great time. I think if you're a history teacher, you just kind of throw the lavender scare in at the same time, and you know, look how well they parallel. Because both of them are the same thing. They believe that there are people in the government that are going to give away our secrets, and therefore we must call them out. So what we're seeing with our LGBTQ plus employees is that people are believing, oh, well, they're going to be blackmailed easily if they're LGBTQ plus. People are going to, write about the letters and, send pictures and show people and show all these people like, oh my God. So people start getting fired because of their sexuality or their perceived sexuality. Whether or not it's true, who knows? But a very important time in history to note that the Red Scare is not only the reason why people are getting fired. Okay, and I kind of want to slowly start wrapping us to an end. I'm not really going past Stonewall. I really don't want to talk about Stonewall in specific. It is one of our most well-known stories in history, so I didn't really want to just relay the story of Stonewall. But I want to just mention that, Stonewall is not the start of gay liberation. We have always been here. We went all the way back. This presentation started pre-colonialism, right? It was already here. We arrived. We saw it was here in the early days in the 1600s. We saw it was here in the Revolutionary War. We saw it was here during the Civil War. It was here during every single time period in the United States history. So when people say that Stonewall is the movement that started it all, I really want to say no. We have always been moving. We've always been pushed back. And it's Stonewall that really shoots us off because of now we are not in one location. We are over the United States. We are connected with each other, and we have the tools to push nationally about what happened at Stonewall. So we can't forget Stonewall, and we can't forget the importance of what that did to really put our foot into that door. But we've been knocking out that door for centuries, and we've been there telling people that we're here, fighting off lies and trying to persuade people into the right way. And I really just want to end this presentation and everything I kind of really talked about today with just a bunch of different people. And I try to pick people who were Black, Indigenous, or people of color, especially today. We're in this time where LGBTQ rights have really progressed a lot, and acceptance of LGBTQ plus people in the United States has really skyrocketed. But a lot of the time, those people were white individuals. I always have very mixed feelings about the TV show Glee, because although it has some very good positives, there's a huge list of negatives. But one of my biggest complaints with Glee was that the 3-4 main gay characters of that show were all white men. And we had the character Santana Lopez, played by Naya Rivera, who of course was a person of color and bisexual on the show, but that was really our only person of color for the LGBTQ plus community in a show that millions of people watched. So I just wanted to mention some of these other people, like Ma Rainey, who was the mother of blues, who was possibly a lesbian. She sang openly lesbian songs. She mentors Betty Smith, who is a bisexual blues singer. Roberta Cowell, who was the first known British trans woman to undergo sex reassignment surgery in the 1950s. And as well as Michael Dillon, which, funny enough, assists in Cowell's transition and then later transitions themselves. Gladys Bentley, another Black lesbian blues singer, she also cross-dresser. Sylvia Rivera, of course, are most well known for Stonewall, also co-founding STAR, and did a lot of social justice work. Jose Julio Azaria, who was a drag queen, but also an activist and was the first openly gay candidate for public office in San Francisco. And now you should all know why San Francisco is an LGBTQ plus capital of the world. And it's not just because it's San Francisco, there is historical reasons behind that. And then lastly, I wanted to mention Alfred Kinsey and Oscar Wilde for different reasons. Alfred Kinsey, because the Kinsey scale is revolutionary for when it comes out, because for thousands of years, it's male and female. Some cultures is a third, but most of the time it's A or B. And Alfred Kinsey, it literally comes out and says, okay, wait a minute. What if there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Like, what if there was a range you could be? And this really starts that conversation and that idea of, whoa, wait a minute, you're right. What if there's more than just A and B? What if there's this spectrum and an individual can fall anywhere on that spectrum? It also is a shocker because he's saying, yeah, all of these men that answered this survey, yeah, some of them are openly admitting to having relationships with another man. And that's really the kicker. The first ones are really already shocking. But the second one is, wait, you're saying that my friend Bob might have answered that survey and he might have said he's had relationships with another man? That's really shocking to a lot of people at that time because nobody's talking about this. Of course, we have the experts talking about it. And I'm sure these are conversations that briefly show up in conversations between friends and family. But Alfred Kinsey does a lot. And I don't think enough people really talk about the immediate impact of his work on that time period. And then I want to end with Oscar Wilde to kind of bring us back to the beginning when I said LGBTQ plus and queer people. Oscar Wilde is a very interesting person. He's an Irish poet. He is, of course, arrested and tried and prosecuted for having sex with a man. But he's one of these people who traditionally would say, oh, Oscar Wilde, gay, or Oscar Wilde, bisexual. But he's, again, one of these people who, well, no, we can't say he's gay or bisexual. We really can't say he's gay. He has a loving marriage. He has kids, but he had, he had relationships with a man, but we don't know what that means. We don't know Oscar Wilde. We are not Oscar Wilde, and we can't ask Oscar Wilde. But it's keeping this idea of all of these people are amazing, and the history of us is amazing, but we know so much, but we also always need to be cautious to how we apply things because we want the history. We want people to say, yes, we've always been here. And I think sometimes we grab onto people and grab onto moments and say, oh, well, that letter between Lafayette and Washington, there's something there. And we want to grab onto that, but we have to tell ourselves and remind ourselves that there is something there, but we don't know what that something is, and that's okay. But we do need to remind ourselves that, yes, we've always been here. Although we don't always know in the way, shape, positive, negative, who knows, we've always been here. So I would like to thank, of course, these books and everything, and I did say I wanted to show you these. So the first one was A Queer History of the United States by Michael Bronsky, a very great book. I read it in a day. I've been doing that lately. And the other one is We Are Everywhere. This is a newer book by Matthew Reimer and Leighton Brown. A great book. This one really focuses on later history from about the 1950s, 60s to now. A Queer History of the United States is starting with that colonial, pre-colonial period that I started with and straight into the Puritans. Some of the other places that I got a lot of my sources, of course, were the internet, at Mr. Shoe Class on TikTok for that opening quote. And then also Mr. Greg Jenner. He is, I wrote it incorrectly in the references and I'm not surprised. He is the host of You're Dead to Me, which is a history podcast where he brings on one historian and one comedian. It is a great listen. If you like to listen to podcasts, have an hour, have to drive an hour to work sometimes, like myself. It is a great podcast to listen to. The comedian's always funny, and you get to learn a lot about history. They have a whole episode about queer history. Their episode, of course, is focusing on the United Kingdom because that's where they're based. But they do mention some of the United States people that I mentioned in today's presentation, and it's overall just a great podcast. So Greg Jenner, you're dead to me. And of course, in my notes, because I'm an ASL teacher, I wrote, you're deaf to me instead of dead. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and also type that in the chat. Oh, and I literally wrote deaf again and caught it before I sent it. But that's how ingrained it is in my head. It's been years since my bachelor's degree, but I always had to write deaf, deaf, deaf. So thank you all for listening to my presentation.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dichiricio. This is just amazing. And I agree. We would like to have this as a curriculum, so you get on that. And anytime you want to talk with us, we would be happy to set something up. I really appreciate it as a really informational session for me, and I think others as well. Do we have time for a couple questions, or I know you need to get back. Okay, is there anybody? Maybe we'll take a couple. Anybody has anything?
I have a question. It's Amber.
Hi.
I know that this was recorded. Is there anywhere that we will be able to find this at a later date?
Yes. I'm not sure where.
I actually have an email that I'm typing up to you, so
okay, perfect.
To both of you. Yeah.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you.
I will definitely.
I've also gone ahead and just put my email in the chat. If anybody would like this PowerPoint, please just feel free to send me an email. I would gladly share this PowerPoint with you. Same with if you want me to send you Amazon links to the books or other resources, just let me know. I have them all saved.
Thank you so much.
All right. Again, thank you all for participating and listening, and thanks again to Mr. Dichiricio for a really interesting time together. Thank you all for coming. I will figure out how to get the recording taken care of and let you know. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for this awesome presentation.